March 22nd, 1984. This is Joe Todd, an interview with Dale Campbell. Okay. Mr. Campbell, where were you born?
In Keokuk, Iowa.
And when's your birthday?
November the 5th, 1924.
1924. Who was your father?
Russell Campbell.
And who was your mother?
Edna Thompson Campbell.
Were they both from Iowa?
No, they're from Illinois. They went across the river to have me. I was raised in Illinois, but the hospital was in Keokuk.
Okay, how long did you live in Illinois?
Oh, I lived there till I had been through the Navy 3 years and went to school at Ames, Iowa. About 22 years.
Yeah. Where did you start school?
Where did I start the school?
Yeah.
I started school at University of Illinois before the war, and I went there a semester before the Navy got a hold of me, and then I came back and went to Carthage College at Carthage, Illinois for 2 years. That was a Lutheran school there, and then I went to Ames, Iowa, and that's where I graduated from, Iowa State.
Okay, in the Navy, what'd you do?
I was a radar technician.
Was radar fairly new in World War II?
Yeah, it just been developed a few years before the war.
What were your duties as a radar technician?
Well, it was a service, a maintenance type work. You had to tune the equipment, and then you had to maintain it. And if it, just like a television technician or a radio technician today, if it went belly up, well, you had to try to find out what part was bad and replace it.
Okay, where did you serve mainly?
I was out in the South Pacific most of the time.
Did people put much faith in radar at that time?
Oh, you bet. You bet. They'd had it turned on at Pearl Harbor when they should have. They didn't know what was going on there.
What part of the South Pacific were you in?
I was down in the Admiralty Islands and over around Guam. We were ferrying planes from Pearl Harbor down to Manus in the Admiralty Islands, and we'd pick up a load of wrecks and bring them back to Pearl Harbor, be repaired. I was on a little CVE-3 carrier. It was a converted cargo ship, but they had put a 400-foot flight deck on. And we'd haul new planes out there and CBs out there, and then we'd bring the wrecks back with us.
Okay, and was this part of the radar technician?
Well, yeah, I was assigned to this ship, and I was one of my duties was to help keep the radar gear on that ship up.
Okay. Now, in the radar, you have to have two. You send the signal and it bounces back?
That's right. We had radar, you know, that works above the water, and then we had sonar that worked under the water. All works on the principle of sending out electric impulse, and the time it takes for it to bounce back is what determines the distance that you're talking about.
Okay. How effective was that in helping to win the war, the radar?
Well, it just prevented somebody from slipping up on your blind side is what it did, you know. It enabled you to know that the enemy or something was out there, and you could determine what it was by the signals that you were receiving back. But it just prevented sneak attacks is what it did, you know.
Were you involved in any major battles in the South Pacific?
No.
What'd you do in VJ Day?
I was in the day that happened, I was in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, on a new cruiser that we were down there on what they call shakedown, which is trying to find out what's wrong with it before the Navy would accept it. But we had gotten aboard that thing in Norfolk, and we were down, and we'd gone out for 6 weeks of shakedown, which was maneuvers and trying all the guns and everything, the airplanes and all that stuff that was on it, and that's where I was aboard ship down there. So there wasn't much I did on VJ Day except shout a couple of times.
And then you went back to Illinois after the war?
Yeah, after the war, went back home and went to Carthage College those 2 years. Then I went to Iowa State and graduated from there in 1951.
And Forestry?
Yes.
Who was head of the forestry department up there at Ames?
At the time I graduated, a man by the name of George Hartman. He had been an industrial forester, had worked for a Long Bell Lumber Company down in this country for a long time, and he'd gone back to teaching. And when I graduated, he was the head of the department.
Okay. And after you graduated, what was your first job?
I went to work for an outfit in Louisville, Kentucky, Gamble Brothers. They were a specialty company that made such things as bowling balls, TV cabinets, and things like that. I studied for 6 weeks to become a hardwood lumber inspector. And after I'd been in Louisville 6 weeks, they sent me down to Montgomery, Alabama, where they had another plant that where they bought hardwood lumber and dried it and cut it up and shipped it to Louisville for assembly.
I was going to ask, what made you decide to go into forestry?
Well, it appeared to me to be the kind of job I liked. Always liked to be outside work and an opportunity to hunt and fish and enjoy the outdoors. I think forestry has deceived a lot of young men, and they think it's kind of a glamorous job. And at that time I went into forestry, most of the public thought all you did was sit on a fire tower someplace. That was a forester's main obligation or duty, but that wasn't the case.
And how long did you work in Kentucky?
I was over there in Louisville 6 weeks and then went to Montgomery, and I stayed in Montgomery 6 months, and a friend of mine that I graduated with had gone to work for Dierks, and they had an opening over here, and he called me, and I came over here and applied for it and got the job, so I moved over here. I graduated in March of '51 and moved to Eagletown in December of '51.
So you came here in 1951.
Yes.
What was your first job with Dierks?
I was assistant district forester at Eagletown.
And what did that entail?
Oh, we was cruising timber. The timber Dierks had owned it had never been cruised. The volume had never been estimated. It had never been mapped. So we cruised the timber, estimated the volumes. We mapped the stands where the hardwood was and the pine was. We drew in the terrain features, and we also marked timber for harvest.
Okay, what does that entail, mark timber?
Well, you went through it. We'd run a blaze line around 40 acres. And then we'd go in there and we'd mark the trees with paint that we thought should be taken out. Mm-hmm. It could be posts or hardwood logs or saw logs. But these will all be 3 different operations. We'd be operating 140 per post and another one for saw logs and hardwood logs. Primarily, that's the first 2 years we were working.
Then what'd you do?
Then I got promoted to district forester, and I stayed at Eagletown for 12 years in that position. We had a lot of fire to fight. We did some land acquisition work. The tract of land would come up on our district, and we'd go out and estimate the volume and value of the timber and the land and try to acquire it if the price was right. Did a lot of public relations work in the community.
I was going to ask, how have firefighting methods changed since '51 to the present?
Lord, we went out there with a little old Ford tractor. It was the best thing we had. A little old bomb trailer behind a pickup truck. It's a wonder we didn't all get killed. Way underpowered for the job we was trying to do and the type of terrain we were trying to do it in. But today they've got some D6 tractors with gopher blades on the front of them and good Seco fire plows on the back of them and trucks and trailers big enough to handle the equipment, and got helicopters with dump buckets on them and aerial bombers if it gets bad enough. And well, they've just taken a lot of the slave labor out of it is what they've done. We did a lot of ours in the end of a fire rake.
Okay. What's a fire rake?
There's 2 kinds of fire rakes. I don't know where one of them they call a California rake. It kind of looks like an overgrown garden rake. It's got longer teeth and just heavier.
Is this what you use to help set the backfires with?
Yeah, you can use that California rake for the backfires, but they had backfire torches, kerosene torches that we used mostly.
Okay. Were most of the fires deliberate in this part of the country?
About 90% of them.
How come?
Well, most people in timbered areas have all sorts of reasons for burning. Some thought it would get early grass, some thought it would kill ticks, and some knew that it improved the deer hunting, and some people just don't like large timber companies. That's just kind of natural. You know, if you got much more land than I have, I'm kind of envious of you, so I'll see if I can't kind of even that score a little bit. All that depends on the large company's public relations program and how well they do that and what kind of fire situation you have.
When did Dierks first open up here?
They came to DeQueen, Arkansas in 1898, and they came over into this country and started acquiring land, I think around 1905 or 1906, somewhere in there. They built a sawmill at Wright City, what was Bismarck at that time, in 1916. And I think they had a mill at Broken Bow in 1912.
Where did they come from?
Came from Iowa.
Iowa?
Mm-hmm.
And any reason why they chose this part of the country, Arkansas and Oklahoma?
I don't know why they finally ended up here, except they were in the retail lumber business up in Iowa and Nebraska. Come from around, I think Walnut Grove, Iowa is where they originated from. They moved down to Broken Bow, Nebraska, and they had retail outlets along there. And they got down to DeQueen, Arkansas, and there was a planer mill and a sawmill for sale over there, and that's the first time they got into the manufacturing end of lumber. And I think they probably stayed here because there was an availability of a resource that was reasonably priced, and land was reasonably priced, and we just went on from there.
You said they were in Broken Bow, Nebraska?
Yeah.
Does that have anything to do with Broken Bow?
Yeah, that's what they named Broken Bow after, Oklahoma after. They established that Broken Bow, Oklahoma, I think about 1912.
Was Broken Bow a camp town?
Yeah. Broken Bow, Eagletown, Wright City was a mill town primarily, but as far as logging camp towns, Eagletown was the first one. They logged around Broken Bow and just hauled directly to the mill, and they did the same over at Wright City. Then when the timber got too far distant from the mill to log on a wagon with mules or oxen, they started building logging railroads, spurs they called them. And they got so far back with that it was more economical to establish a camp out there and have people live some distance from the mill, so they didn't have to spend half the day riding to work and half the day getting back. So they established camps. They had one at Eagletown about 1920, 21, and they stayed there till about 1928, I believe, and then they moved 9 miles north of Eagletown. And they would log this area and then either move on or go back and go someplace else. But they had a spur up near the every major branch in the country around here. When they got through laying grade stakes for the railroad, they were 75 miles northeast of Wright City when they quit.
Yeah. What kind of houses did the camp towns consist of?
Had what they call shotgun houses. They were they were just about the width, a little bit wider than a log car, because they picked them up and put them on log cars to move them. Call them shotgun houses, but they'd be 2 or 3 rooms right in a row. You could run in the front door and go through all 3 rooms and out the back door.
Were they modern?
No. No.
You said they were movable?
Yeah, they moved them. They picked them up when they got through ready to move the camp. Well, they loaded those cars up on the railroad cars and up to the next spot they went.
Are there any of those camp houses left?
Yeah, there's 2 right there at the north edge of Broken Bow on the west side of the road across from, it's above Sherry's Drive-In there, and I could show them to you if we was down there. And there's some up where Cleveland is now. When they got through with that sort of business back in about 1967, they sold all their houses to the people that were living in them.
When did they first construct those houses?
Oh golly, I don't know. I imagine about 1920s when they first started. Yeah.
Anyone ever thought of bringing one down here to restore?
No, I don't guess there's any left that aren't occupied or hasn't been.
Yeah.
Most of them been severely remodeled.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people took them when they got them for sale and set 2 side by side, which made a pretty decent shaped house.
Whenever Dierks, cut all the trees and move the camp towns on out, when do they start the first forest management, replanting?
It wasn't a matter of replanting, it was a seed tree operation that started in 1928. Uh, it's kind of ironic, my father-in-law, Tuck Burnett, was the one that instigated that because he felt like that there was a good possibility that the area would grow another crop of trees. The Dierks people were not at all convinced that there was ever going to be another crop of trees. They thought that the crop that they had cut, the virgin stand that was here, that was it, that there was no hope or no economics to trying to raise another crop. And up north of Eagletown in 28, he started leaving seed trees. It was what they called a cutter's choice. They were to leave so many trees per acre of their choice. That was kind of a bad deal because the cutters left the poor trees, left an inferior seed source. Had it been done properly, that's pretty good management on poor sites. But anyway, they started that up there in 1928, and when I came down here in 1951, you could definitely see the results of it. There were thick stands of post-sized material out of those old seed trees. It had worked. But that wasn't done all over the old holdings. It was just in that one area that was started. And then they were still clear cutting up during the war. And after the war, they hired a couple of foresters, and they hired a couple of what we call technicians today to do some timber marking. But it was along 40s, 46, I would say, 47s, 48 before they ever did any of that. Other than that, well, it's just cutter's choice.
Did World War II increase the industry down here?
Oh yeah, it was quite a boon for the industry because they could sell everything they could manufacture.
What were the main products they made for the war effort?
Oh, well, outside of regular dimension and finished lumber, they made a lot of hardwood lumber that was used for crating material and things of this nature. But just about anything that a lumber company would produce during a war time is usable for that effort.
Yeah. Okay. Does Weyerhauser use a seed tree operation?
No, they don't use seed tree operation, not here anyway. They may out west someplace, I don't know about that, but not here.
How does Weyerhauser and Dierks differ in their?
Well, it's much more intensive management with Weyerhauser. They clear cut an area and then they go in there and do what they call site preparation, clean it up, and try to get it back in a pine plantation within 1 year after it's been cut.
Which is the best method?
Well, if you want to grow the maximum amount of timber, you'd use a Weyerhauser method, because it's just like if you had a cornfield, you wouldn't go out there and just harvest part of the corn. You'd go get it all at once, and you wouldn't wait for nature to take care of putting corn back there again. You'd plow it up and do what cultural things need to be done. And there's nothing different with growing trees than there is crop of corn, except it just takes longer. Same principles are involved.
Well, how come Dierks had the seed tree operation?
Well, they had a seed tree operation there for a few years, but then after the war, when they started marking what they call selective harvesting trees, it was a philosophy that management had, that they weren't going to clear cut anymore. I suppose the early foresters had convinced them that if they weren't going to go in there and prepare the site after they clear cut and plant it, that wasn't the way to go. In a selective single tree selection system, the poor trees are removed and the better ones are left to grow to a larger size, and then you usually went through an area every 5 to 10 years and took out a few of the trees. And in the process, you got reproduction back under the remainder, so you had a continuous forest there, and you didn't have any large regeneration costs or anything like that. The only thing you had to worry about was fire going through there and removing your seedlings when you didn't need it.
How long does it take in the Weyerhauser method from the time they replant they can harvest the first trees?
Oh, they'll start thinning that stuff, I imagine, 15 to 18 years of age. And probably let it grow to 30, 35 before they clear cut it and do it
And
again.
how large an area did they clear cut at one time?
Their policy is to keep the clear cuts under 300 acres.
3,300 acres?
No, 300 acres.
300 acres?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think they've got some that might be a tad over that, but that is the policy now.
Who first had the idea for the Heritage Center? Whose idea was that?
Well, it was I think you'd have to go back to the fellow that popped in my office, and I'm going to be hard pressed to come up with his name, but John Bain can help us out on that. But he was the district forester at Broken Bow for the State Division of Forestry, and I was logging superintendent at the time, I believe. Anyway, I was in Broken Bow, and he'd been off on vacation and had run up on this little logging museum where they had some old logging equipment stuff. And he come into my office kind of wild-eyed one day and said, "Man, we ought to do something like that here in Broken Bow." And said we could put it right over there in that arboretum, right across the where the American State Bank is now was a Dierks Arboretum that we'd planted all sorts of tree species in. He said we could set it right over there, and I guess it was Weyerhauser was here at the time because they were going to dispose of the depot in Broken Bow, and said we could get that depot, use it for the museum building, and said my job was going to be to gather up all this old Dierks equipment that had been junk sitting around here and there. But I think that's the first thought of it.
What year was that?
Oh, it'd have to be about 69 or 70 probably.
And how did it develop out here in Beaver's Bend?
Well, I left this country in '72. I was moved to Hot Springs, Arkansas, and I kind of lost contact with it. And I don't know how it got placed up here, except that they negotiated with the state park system to have a 5-acre tract here and put this building on. And it was supposed to be at that time privately owned by the board and privately operated by the board. They didn't charge admission when they first set it up, but like I told you earlier, they didn't have any plans to come up with an operating budget, and they got money problems right quick.
How is it supported now?
This is through the state tourism.
Okay.
They pay all the bills. The State Division of Forestry is responsible for all the exhibits and the educational program. That's John Bain's job.
And who was the first director?
Lee Clymer was the first director. He's from Antlers. He was with OSU Extension. He had sugar diabetes and never did get to come over here and perform as director. He did some of the work from his home as far as the planning and things like that. The murals that you see around there were his idea, or he was in on the early concept of that. But he ended up losing a leg and ended up having a heart attack and dying, and never did get to come over and serve.
And did you take his place?
Yes, I took his place in.
Okay, what were your major duties as director?
Well, had to maintain the building, of course, and the main thing that we were interested in that time was to try to acquire all the artifacts that we could that were floating around this country with no particular home. And I knew a lot of people that had a lot of things, and John and I spent the first 2 years pretty much just gathering stuff, cataloging it, and making exhibits that we could. And then we got started with Harry Rosal on these dioramas around here. And at the start, we were putting up about 2 of those a year, and making exhibits and inviting groups to come, holding programs and guided tours and things of that nature.
Okay, when did you come on board as director?
1977,
1977.
May.
And how long did you serve as director?
I guess I was here till about '81. Then I went to work for the Oklahoma Forestry Association.
Okay, that's where you work now?
Yes.
Okay. What are you doing with the association?
Well, it's an industry-sponsored program. We lobby the legislature. We have forestry judging contests with 4-H and FFA. We present slideshows, things of that nature.
How is the center here organized? Is the director, board of directors?
Yeah, they have a board of directors. It's what they call an advisory board now, but they're responsible for any new programs or anything, that they want. Well, they're supposed to come up with the money. Now, the State Division of Forestry is paying for the dioramas for Harry Rosales' part. But the board advises John and State Parks and Division of Agriculture on what they want done, or what they'd like to see done, what programs they'd like to have carried out.
Okay. How long did you work for Dierks?
18 years.
Started in '51 and you left in?
They were acquired by Weyerhauser in '69, and then I worked for Weyerhauser for 5 years.
Okay. How long you work as district forester?
I was out there 12 years.
12 years. What'd you do after that?
I was logging superintendent here in Broken Bow.
Okay, what's logging superintendent do?
Well, we was required. We had the Wright City sawmill. We had 3 company logging crews, and we had a bunch of contract loggers. And I was in charge of the railroad from Wright City to Cleveland, 32 miles of railroad, and in charge of all the company shops. I had one at Wright City, at Cleveland, and one at Broken Bow repair shops where they repaired trucks and tractors. I was in charge of road construction.
Okay, are all the logs hauled by truck nowadays?
Yes.
Okay, when did the railroads go out?
They sold that railroad in about 1973, I believe, somewhere along there. That one from Cleveland to Wright City.
Okay. And were you logging superintendent under Weyerhauser also?
No, I had been with Dierks. I was logging superintendent from '66 to '69, and then they moved me to DeQueen, Arkansas, and I was production manager, which was a grandiose title for being responsible for all of the timber production in Arkansas and Oklahoma both. We had logging crews at Dierks, Arkansas, and Mountain Pine, Arkansas, plus the ones over here. And I was responsible for all of them and all the contractors, plus the post and pole production that went to the treating plant at DeQueen. That's what I was doing when Weyerhauser came down here. And then they grabbed me up and moved me back to Wright City as woods manager in '69, December.
What does the woods manager do?
Well, he was in charge of all the woods operation, both forestry and logging. He had all of the woods operation as his responsibility, about 800 and some odd thousand acres here in Oklahoma.
Now, do they own this land outright or
Yes.
just lease it?
No, it's all owned.
Okay.
They have fee ownership on it.
So you say 800 and some thousand acres?
In Oklahoma, they own about 1,900,000 between Arkansas and Oklahoma. It's a piece of property.
Good chunk of land.
Yes.
How come Dierks sold out?
Well, that question bothered me for a long time when I moved to Hot Springs. Peter George, who was one of the principal owners, lived there, and he had a restaurant that I inhabited once in a while, and I caught him down there one night, and we had supper together. And afterwards, he invited me up to his house. He was a big collector of Chinese art, and he wanted me to go up there and see some of that stuff that he had bought. And I went up there, and we got to talking around, and I finally just point blank asked him, "What the hell do you sell this business for?" And he told me, he said, well, Dale, he said, it got too large to manage the way we wanted to manage it. They were a family company, it was all family owned, and they had a family member that was in charge of each main operation. They had one that was in charge of all the logging, and that was Pete. He was the guy that, as logging superintendent, that you answered to. And then they had one that was in charge of all the plants and all plant construction. And they didn't have enough family members to stretch to increase their manufacturing operations, and they had a hard time delegating authority to non-family members. Is the way I read it. And when they run out of family, they decided to do something else. Also, I suspect that government regulations were becoming bothersome. They were a family that was afraid to borrow money. They had gone into the hands of receivership back in the Depression, and when they finally bought their way out of that about 1940, they all were gun shy when it came to borrowing money. They borrowed $25 million to build a Pine Bluff paper mill in 1955 or 56, and man, they had all sorts of tremors before they got that paid back. Then they built the treating plant. In 1948, they built that with their own money, as far as I know. In 1960, they built the Craig plant with their own money. And in 63 or 4, they built the Briar plant with their own money. But these were not high-powered $100 million plants as we think of construction today. They were relatively cheap, you know, $3 or $4 million. But they didn't want to ever have big debt. That scared them. And the reason a lot of the reason they used a single tree selection in forestry was that they had more timber than they had manufacturing capabilities for. But yet they wanted to continue to assert their ownership. They had a fear that the state might decide they didn't need all that land and might try to do something with it. I know Pete told me in 1967, he says we need to go up on the head of Little River. This is up toward Kiamish Mountain. And we need to spend a couple of summers up there harvesting some timber. He says.
Now where was this?
Up on the head of Little River, just south of Kiamish Mountain, east of Honebby.
But could the state take the land for state park?
I don't know, but they had a different attitude about Oklahoma from year one. They really never intended to stay in Oklahoma. The land they knew was of poorer quality than what they had in Arkansas. And they had moved from Kansas City down to Hot Springs. And Pete told me one time that he and Fred Jr. had a group up around Poto that was interested in buying the north half of what they owned in Oklahoma. They just came a spat of selling it. And they were real tickled about it because they had a long time before they got their mind made up that it was worth keeping. The attitude the people had when they came over here and some of the things that happened to them made them think that this place was nothing less than an anarchy. I know when I left the Weyerhauser Company, went down to Louisiana, worked a couple of years, and came back to Broken Bow. I went back to Hot Springs and I visited Fred Dierks, and he was saying to me, he said, well, I'd lost track of you the last 3 years. Said, where are you living now? And I told him Broken Bow. Oh my goodness, why'd you go back over there for? I said, well, Lord, since 51, it's been my home. You know, I've been around it or in it all that time. Well, he said, we always had a hard time staying in Oklahoma. He said, we seem to never have anything but problems over there, and said it looked to us like there wasn't any law enforcement, that it was just a regular anarchy. And I said, well, what makes you say that? Because I had not that opinion of the place at all. He said, well, when we first started over there, said we were hauling water in railroad cars into the mill at Broken Bow, and said the natives just loved to shoot holes in those railroad cars with their 30s, watch the water spurt. Said we ended up having to build a Broken Bow City Lake to supply water for the town. Well, I knew they'd built the lake, but I didn't know for what reason. And he said they did the same thing to us over in the Wright City area. And he said, He said, we just had a terrible time with the people. Said they just were a lawless bunch. He was still feeling this way. Now, this was in 1977 or 78. He still had this attitude toward the people over here. And it worried me a little, because I'd found a lot of nice people over here, you know, and I had lived long enough in this world to think that there was 4 or 5% of bad eggs in the country anywhere you went. Right. And but he had all of them in the bad egg category over here. And I got to thinking about it. They had their office in Kansas City, and the only time they came down here was when there was a strike on or some big upheaval. And the only time he was in the country, they had trouble. Mm-hmm. And so he just related that to, never thought about the times he wasn't down here and things were going smooth. It was always a bad time.
Had a slanted viewpoint.
Yeah, sure. But it amused me after I got kind of easy in my mind, because I respected his thoughts about things, having known him all those years and worked with him, and then to have him come up with that kind of a jaundiced view, and what I call, well, he was extremely critical, you know, and thought I was kind of silly for even moving back over here in this terrible place.
Let me see, what haven't we covered? What kind of work your father do?
Pardon?
What kind of work your father do?
Oh, he was in the grocery business. He ran a grocery store for 23 years. Then modern times caught up with him, and he went to work for the State Division of Highway.
And you say you were raised in Illinois?
Yes.
What part?
West Central part, a little old town called Elveston. It's north of Quincy, 40 miles. You'll find Quincy on the map.
Was Gem City College still going?
Yeah, my sister graduated from there.
She did.
How do you know about the Gem City Business College?
Oh, I've talked to some people that went to school up there.
Is that right? Musselmans had that college. Musselmans, they were the people that owned it.
Was the brewery still going there, was it the Dick's beer?
No, you're talking about the brewery at Warsaw, Illinois.
Is that Warsaw? I thought there was one at Quincy too.
No, if there was, I wasn't aware of it. There was Greasy Dick Brothers brewery was operating in Warsaw when I grew up. But I don't know of a brewery in Quincy now.
Okay. Well, what kind of college was Gem City College?
It's business college. Business college. My sister graduated from there. I think she went, I think it was a 9 months course. Mm-hmm. You learned to be a stenographer, bookkeeper. Had a pretty good reputation back at that time.
There's a lower section of town in Quincy called, what was that called?
I never heard a name for it.
I can't think of it.
The lower section?
Yeah.
Well, all down along the river, are you talking about?
Yeah.
Well, it's all industrialized down through there. They've got plant after plant.
Well, this would have been years ago. It was, they had another name for it.
Never heard it.
Well, I think we have a good interview, I think. Anything else about the center that we've missed?
No, I can't think of anything.
Who was the architect for the building?
Outfit out of Oklahoma City. What's that? It's out here on the wall. We'll find out.
Yeah, well, that's okay. Okay, thank you.
You bet. Named T.E. Musselman. And even back then, he was some kind of a bird lover, because he would come to the school each year and give a talk on birds, and putting up bluebird boxes. That was his bag. And I remember 4 or 5 times there in grade school that he would come and give a program on that subject, about 15, 20 minutes. And it was also a recruiting trip for him, because he talked to the seniors about coming to Gem City to go to school. Now, I don't know whether that was a family college or not, whether they had it back when this lady was there or not. I have no idea, because he was a middle-aged man at the time I knew him.
When did that college finally close?
Shoot, I don't know.
I need your...
John Henry.